Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into the absolute darkest, most rusted corners of history to investigate the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty. We're going to separate the grisly facts from the sensational fictions of the Middle Ages, specifically zeroing in on those terrifying torture devices that have haunted our imaginations for centuries.
So, let's kick things off by asking you to picture the absolute worst, most diabolical punishment imaginable from the Dark Ages. You know, when you think of a damp, terrifying medieval dungeon, what immediately springs to mind? What single contraption really embodies the absolute peak of human cruelty from that era?
I bet you're picturing the Iron Maiden, right? It's a massive pop culture staple. Basically, it's a human-shaped iron cabinet featuring heavy hinged doors lined with short, strategically placed spikes. The whole horrific idea was that when those doors were shut, the spikes wouldn't actually kill the victim instantly. Instead, they'd slowly pierce the arms, legs, and non-vital organs, causing an agonizingly slow death by bleeding. I mean, it's literally an invention designed to evoke unimaginable suffering.
And that incredibly specific, horrific imagery, it actually stems directly from a highly detailed account of an execution that supposedly took place way back in the year 1515. The story goes that a coin forger in Nuremberg, Germany, was locked inside one of these things, making a great cry and lament for 2 straight days before finally dying. But, well, here's the catch. This account, it was actually written by an 18th century philosopher named Johann Philipp Siebenkees in 1793.
So here's the massive twist. The Iron Maiden is a complete hoax. It was entirely fabricated centuries after the Middle Ages had already wrapped up. The myth promises this widespread medieval use and fatal iron spikes, but the historical reality is that it was simply an 18th century invention. Those terrifying devices displayed in museums all across Europe and the US in the 19th century, they were actually just patched together by hoaxers, showmen, and con artists looking to make a quick buck.
Part 1. An 18th century hoax, building the myth.
So, how exactly did this happen? How did Victorians and 18th century sensationalists actually build this enduring, spike-filled fiction? Well, hoaxers likely got their initial inspiration from the very real medieval Schandmental, which translates to a barrel of shame or coat of shame. But unlike the fictional lethal impalement coffin, this was a real corporal punishment device made of wood and sheet metal used strictly for public humiliation. It encaged you, sure, but crucially it had 0 spikes. It was meant to embarrass you in the town square, not impale you.
Another real inspiration that got completely twisted by later writers was King Louis XI's fillets. Back during his reign in France in the late 1400s, these were actually just a type of prison cell or iron cage designed to confine individual prisoners. In this really darkly ironic twist of history, what was originally meant to be a pragmatic prison reform aimed at improving order was later reimagined into a sadistic torture device by the hyperactive Victorian imagination.
Part 2. Real medieval torture devices. The regulated reality.
Okay, so if the Iron Maiden is a total myth, what terrifying tools actually existed? Because, let's be clear, torture definitely happened, but it was far more systematic than the wild legends suggest. While it certainly wasn't an everyday occurrence for minor offenses, highly regulated torture was legally sanctioned for serious crimes. Think treason, heresy, or witchcraft. To extract confessions, courts relied on grim, highly practical devices: the rack, thumbscrews, the strappado, and the brutal breaking wheel. These tools weren't myths, they were the terrifying reality of medieval law and order.
Let's zoom in on one of the most infamous ones out there, the rack. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied to rollers, and as the executioner turned the heavy pulleys, the body was stretched until the joints literally dislocated. It's absolutely brutal. It was famously introduced to the Tower of London in 1420 by the Duke of Exeter, specifically to extract information from suspected traitors and conspirators.
Similarly, thumbscrews were a highly effective, agonizing reality. This simple little vice slowly crushed a person's digits, thumbs, big toes, you name it, and was used well into the early modern period. In fact, historical records show they were used during the Inquisition. And get this, the famous abolitionist Thomas Clarkson even carried a pair of them around to demonstrate the horrors occurring on slave ships, which really proves just how long this device remained in dark, practical use.
Part 3. The executioner's reality, the operators of pain.
Now let's shift our perspective for a second and humanize this grim history. Who were the outcasts that actually operated these real torture devices on behalf of the medieval courts? Well, we have these incredible historical records of men like Franz Schmidt. He was the municipal executioner for the city of Nuremberg in the 1500s. And Schmidt was actually a rare, diligent, and entirely sober professional in a very dark trade. He served as both the torturer and executioner for the government, and he carefully documented his work, carrying out whippings, brandings, and executions.
However, Schmidt was definitely an exception in his professionalism. For the most part, executioners were completely despised by their communities. It was considered a deeply, deeply dishonorable profession. Often, a man was forced into it simply because his father was an executioner. The stigma was entirely hereditary. They were social outcasts who frequently had to supplement their income with other really undesirable jobs, like disposing of dead animals.
Part 4. Why We Love Dark Myths. The Psychology of Torture.
Which brings us to a really fascinating psychological question. If the reality of medieval torture was so heavily governed by bureaucratic law and operated by marginalized outcasts, why did society invent and perpetuate grandiose fictions like the Iron Maiden? Well, the answer lies in propaganda. As historian Peter Konichi puts it, it's so much easier to pick on people who've been dead for 500 years. You see, 19th century Victorians literally wrote the Iron Maiden into existence to make their own era look better. If people believed their medieval ancestors were barbaric savages using spike-filled coffins, then the Victorians' own use of public hangings felt incredibly civilized by comparison. It was just a tool to make modern society feel superior.
Tracking this myth through time is absolutely wild. We start way back in 200 BCE with the ancient Greek legend of the Spartan tyrant Nobis, who supposedly had a deadly, spiked statue of his wife. This ancient myth likely inspired our 18th century writer, Siebenkees, to invent the Nuremberg hoax in 1793. From there, 19th century museums physically built these fakes just to sell tickets. And then, history takes a bizarre and truly tragic turn in 2003.
In a horrific twist of fate, the Victorian myth tragically became a reality in the modern era. In 2003, Time magazine reporters discovered an actual, worn-out Iron Maiden at the Iraqi National Olympic Committee complex in Baghdad. Reports indicated that Uday Hussein, Saddam Hussein's son, had actually taken this fictional museum prop and brought it to life, using it to torment and humiliate underperforming athletes. The myth literally became a terrifying modern weapon. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought. We've just dismantled the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty, revealing it as an 18th century fabrication designed to manipulate exactly how we view the past. So, as we separate the sensational myths of the Dark Ages from their highly regulated reality, ask yourself, what other established historical fictions are we blindly accepting as absolute truth today? Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive into history.